Hi everyone, this is Miss Miller, and today we are going to extend what you already know about narrative point of view. We will do a case study on Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, but by the end of this lesson, you'll be closer to analyzing the complex narration of your own novel. In Heart of Darkness, there are 3 dominant points of view in the novel, and we'll discuss this towards the end of this lesson. Just know that point of view is so significant to a work that some literary enthusiasts argue that narrative voice from which a story is told is the most important literary element in a work. Authors take great pride in selecting point of view to present character, dialogue, action, settings, and events. You can look at this illustration and you can see whether the narrative point of view for character in Kite Runner, you might recognize some of these titles, or dialogue in Raisin in the Sun, or the action in Frankenstein, even the setting in Handmaid's Tale, and the events in Joy Luck Club. But obviously, when an author is thinking about this for a particular work, he or she is thinking about each of these elements for their work, which best way to present it. Your job in examining a literary work is to identify the lens from which a story is told. The predominant lens include first and third person, and rarely will you ever see or come across second person. But we can examine that later. First person includes any pronouns usage of I, me, us, and we. Typically, first person is a participant in the story to some degree. And some say never trust a narrator who's also a character in the story. When multiple points of view are applied to a text, not only may reading be more complex, but it certainly adds to a layer of the text. Third person includes an outside narrator, and that's when the narrator refers to characters for he, she, they, and also maybe even referencing their names of the individuals. Some of the disadvantages of first person, though, is the narrator does not have access to the minds of other characters. They don't know what they're thinking. So the information that they provide us is limited. And they can only be in one place at one time. So if the narrator is first person, they can't tell us about something that's happening in a different location or setting. And oftentimes, first-person narration, because it's coming from one person, it's inaccurate assessment. Sometimes they have inaccurate assessments of other characters. You probably notice that, or you'll see it in even the Heart of Darkness, but you'll notice it in some of your readings where you know something about a character, but it doesn't seem like the narrator is aware of it, or they seem to not assess an individual accurately. And oftentimes they have partial understanding of the truth. So think about what that looks like in the text that you're reading. And if we think about Heart of Darkness, it's very clear. Even Marlowe, which is a first person, he has limited understanding of the truth, and it sort of evolves as the story progresses. So the narrator has blind spots when you use first person, and sometimes they're hiding something, whether they know it or not always. So think about that and what that means in the text. Now, third person point of view, authors assign the degree or extent that they will divulge information, the freedom they possess, and the limitations. Third person can be objective, it can be limited to a character, or it can be omniscient or a God construct. In the case where they are all-knowing, the narrator has 2 options. They can make the narrator intrusive or unintrusive. And there's always descriptions that you could use to describe a narrator. I think a lot of it would be like neutral or objective, and that's what we hope for. But if they are unintrusive, the assumption is that they are impersonal and objective. So third person omniscient point of view, the narrator knows all. Agents, characters acting on behalf of others, the actions, they know the events. They have privileged access to everyone's thoughts, feelings, motivation. They have access to or freedom of movement in time and place, so they can go back and forth in time. They can shift places or settings. They can go between characters, and so that can be really confusing. They can disclose or conceal information. And third person omniscient point of view, because it's all knowing and possibly like a God construct, these are typically, this point of view is reserved oftentimes for really long novels because they have so much to say, because they have so much information. Now, an intrusive narrator is someone, this is interesting, is someone who reports and comments and evaluates. So they don't just tell you what someone is saying or thinking, but they also comment and evaluate the character's actions and motives, and they share their own personal view on life. And so you could probably think of someone who is relaying information to you, and then they tell you what happened, and then and in addition to that, they also tell you what they think about what happened. So they're giving you commentary without allowing you as the reader to decide for yourself. Someone who is intrusive. Now, unintrusive is when there is the narrator is withholding judgment. There's no judgment, and they sort of they eliminate their privilege for access into the feelings of the different characters. So this is an unintrusive narrator who is willing to do that. And this is a radical shift in narration when a third-person omniscient is willing to do that. Now, this is interesting. This is a focus in narration for third-person point of view. And sometimes when you're reading the text, you might say to yourself, well, who's talking? What's going on? And I don't even know who they're even talking about. So you have to know that there is oftentimes a focus in shift, or the focus shifts from narration to character. And this can happen quite quickly and frequently. So you may see where the narrator is talking, where the narration is the storyteller, and then they shift to the perception that the character has, and then they go back to narration. So it can go back and forth. And so narrators in the story, multiple narrators, have a distinct voice. And so you really have to read closely to determine who it is that's speaking. Now, third person limited point of view, is the person, it's limited to one person. Maybe on occasion it can be multiple, but very rare. So limited to one person or one character, what they perceive, their thoughts, what they remember, how they feel. And this is the center of consciousness. And so basically the center of consciousness is where the narrator is pretty much telling you their perceptions, and that's why we have the mirror on the one side. Now, it has evolved the center of consciousness to the stream of consciousness, which is where you have access to continuous current thought, memory, and feelings of a character, and observations of total awareness. Now, the distinction between center of consciousness and stream of consciousness is the center of consciousness sort of communicates the narrator's point of view as it unfolds. So it may be interrupted by dialogue or commentary. However, in the stream of consciousness, it's uninterrupted. It's a continuous current thought. So it's separate from the text, and it's a little bit distant. Now, second person point of view, there's a specific fictional character. It could be the reader, it could be the narrator. It's inconsistent, and it can be shifts in telling it's a narrative from the past. They can go between the past, the present, and the future. And oftentimes, with second person, it can be an involuted fiction, which just means that the narrator is involving the reader and sort of telling them, what exactly that they're doing in the work. In a sense, giving details that maybe a reader wouldn't need to know about how a story is evolving. The self-conscious narrator is giving a disclosure of the fiction. There's a juxtaposition of reality and fiction, and this often has like a serious or comedic effect. Then there's the self-reflexive novel, and that's also considered an involuted fiction. or they include the process. So the self-conscious narrator is saying, well, this, is being explicit about what it's doing in the text as opposed to just telling the story. And then you have the fallible or unreliable narrator, which we often see. Their perceptions and interpretation or their evaluation does not equal the author's opinion of the text. So there's a clear distinction between the two. Now looking at Heart of Darkness, you can see all things. This, by the way, in Heart of Darkness is Kurtz. We hear about him in part 1, and then we meet him later and possibly in part 2. He's the object of affection, and each of the narrators in Heart of Darkness take a position on him and all that he represents. So you're going to hear distinct voices, and we can see how each of the narrators in Heart of Darkness feel about Kurtz. They all have distinct voices, and everything that he represents in terms of imperialism and colonialism in the text. So the first of 3 narrative points of view, perhaps the most prevalent in the text, is Charlie Marlowe. And you hear about him very early, but he is the one who narrates most of the text. And so you have first person is a complex narrative mode. He knows, experiences, infers, discovers everything. He's a minor participant and a narrator character. So if you remember what we talked about earlier with first person, they don't always have all of the information. It's not always accessible to them. And so you want to think about first person as the central character versus the secondary. And in this case, Charlie Marlowe would be the secondary because obviously our focus is on Kurtz. So you're going to hear lots about him. You will know how Charlie Marlowe feels about Kurtz, and this changes as the story progresses. In the initial part of the novel Heart of Darkness, perhaps in part 1 and 2, we see that Charlie Marlowe is enamored and views Kurtz very highly, and because he doesn't know a lot about him. So he's quite naive in the text. The second narration, the unnamed narrator, is this individual who we meet at the very start, who introduces us to Marlowe along with a few other fellows on the boat, and we can understand why he sort of hands the narration over to Charlie Marlowe because he's the only seaman on the boat. But this is the unnamed narrator, his first person point of view, and he has a really clear perception of Kurtz, and he makes it very, very obvious about how he feels about colonialism, and he expresses that in the very beginning. And you can see the shift because you can see he feels quite strongly against colonialism and imperialism, and he kind of expresses that initially at the start, and then we hear he hands it over to Marlowe, which is a little bit more naive in his voice. Now, we won't see this narrator often. He talks very briefly at the beginning and a little bit towards the end of the text. And then this one, the third one, this is less explicit, more implicit, but the author, Joseph Conrad, the third consciousness of the story, which he presents all of his ideas through each of the characters. And so that wraps it up.